What makes the Warriors' attack so unique this year? Will the volume of three-point shots ever level off? Are analytics controlling too much of the action? The only question left is, say it with me, you win. Hey sports fans, Coach Nick here, and welcome to the B-Ball Breakdown Podcast. I am pleased to bring on the show today Ben Cohen, who is a sports reporter for the Wall Street Journal and covers the NBA. And Ben, first of all, thank you for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, man.
And it's a pleasure because, you just wrote an article somewhat recently about the midrange, and it bubbled up into my timeline, and I started to read it, and it was like, it kind of had a profound effect on me because it's been speaking to what I've said for a while. And I wanted you to just sort of give us an outline of what the mid-range article you wrote about the Warriors and what the theme of it was.
Sure. I think we all know like the mid-range has never been less popular in the NBA than it is right now, and for good reason. I mean, we know now, we have the data to show that like the mid-range is just not a very valuable shot. And the three-pointer has kind of overtaken it, and probably the team that was most responsible for that over the last few years was the Warriors, and then of course the Rockets. And one of the interesting things about what the Warriors are doing this season is they're actually kind of bringing the mid-range back a little bit. Basically, old has become new, and become old and then new again. This cycle has happened that teams are so crazy about running the Warriors off the line and protecting the rim that they're giving them all this space in between, because you can take away a lot of stuff with that team, but you can't take away everything. And they took advantage in the regular season, and they're doing it again in the postseason. I mean, this is a team that is getting more value from the mid-range, like the mid-range, not three-point line, not the restricted area, not the mid-range, than any team in like the last 20 years, basically. So the fact that Golden State is, the fact that any team is doing this would be interesting. The fact that Golden State is doing it, and we all know everything about Golden State. I mean, I found it really fascinating, and so a couple other guys explained this strategy to me, and it's not by accident that they're doing this. I mean, it is because there is value there, and they are willing to go anywhere that they think there might be value.
Absolutely. And first of all, we got to describe what the mid-range is, because that's become a four-letter word. And what was frustrating to me is a few years ago is when this became like the term, it kind of encapsulated any shot between like 8 feet and 23 feet before the three-point line or something like that. To me, the mid-range was always like 15, 16, 17 footer, which to a good shooter is like a layup if it's open. And yet, when you talk to the analytics guys, and this is sort of what the crux of what I had issues with over the years discussing this was that, and I get it, if you're an analytics guy and you're a math guy, then it's very black and white, it's very binary. There is a specific answer to every question. And so the idea that you would ever take those shots, was ridiculous. You can't. You are wrong for taking those shots. You shouldn't be taking those. And even if you're not a three-point shooter, you should just back up and shoot behind the line anyway, because you might get that extra point. So that was always what was troubling to me. But what are we defining as far as mid-range, as far as feet from the basket?
Well, I was using the NBA. I mean, when I put together this stat, I was using the NBA's definition of mid-range. But I think that probably 16 to 24 feet is what I think of too. Basically, something that's not in the paint, and you kind of wish, like, why you watch the shot and you're like, why are you shooting there? Just take a couple steps back or drive to the basket. Why are you settling for that type of thing? So, but this was the official, NBA definition when they break it down into zones, basically.
Fair enough. Okay, and again, if we do a little research, I'm sure it's going to be somewhere in that area. And by the way, I'm not even that fond of those shots beyond 20 feet, because then you're getting close. You are getting close enough, but the 17, 18, 19, 20 footer. Is the one that was always sort of like, I couldn't understand why that was going away so much. I mean, I guess what they're looking at, and here's the crux of the matter, is what they're looking at is a macro view of the numbers, right? When they're looking at the percentage of mid-range shots, the field goal percentage, they're like looking at everybody shooting those. Is that fair?
Yeah, totally.
So you're talking about shooters who the defense are happy that they're shooting those shots because they're not good shooters. We're not just looking at like a Kyle Korver shot. You know what I mean? We're not just looking at Kevin Durant or LaMarcus Aldridge. So all of a sudden, to me, it was always a very noisy a stat where they're basing the entire, their whole philosophy of offense on one of the noisiest stats I've ever heard of.
I don't know if that's true though, because I feel like over a whole season and then, over, a whole career, it becomes less noisy. I mean, the fact is, like, I still don't think it's a great shot for most players, right? And especially for most teams. But if you're trying to defend the Warriors, I mean, you know this as well as anyone. What are you supposed to do? You don't want to give them 3-pointers and you don't want to let them drive. So, like, you have to give them something, and probably the mid-range is the best thing to give them, even if they happen to be, like, the best mid-range team of the last 20 years. Like, what else are you supposed to do?
Yeah. And by the way, Jeff Hornacek had a great point a few years ago about this, where in the playoffs, when they are prepared for you, they're going to drive you off the line, or they're going to run you off the line. They're going to wall up so it's hard to get into the paint. So what you're left with, are those mid-range shots. And so are you really going to design a whole offense where you have no experience shooting those in the regular season to then have to take some of those?
It's a really interesting point, and I was there. I was around the team asking them about this in early March, and every single person I talked to was already talking about the playoffs, saying, like, this is going to become a bigger deal in the playoffs when teams take away your first and second and your third options, and we have this to fall back on. And they turned out to be right. So, like, during the regular season, the Warriors took 20 mid-range jumpers a game, and they shot 47% on those. So far in the playoffs, they're up to 25 mid-range jumpers a game, and they're shooting 51%. So they're getting more than a point per possession out of that. And then if you go back to the Pelicans series, the last one, they were at 26.8 mid-range jumpers, so even more than the first round. And then when Steph came back in those last 4 games, they took 28 per game. So they're really living there. And I think we're seeing that, like, even in the Rockets. I mean, no team relies less on mid-range jumpers than the Rockets, and for good reason. But we saw in that Jazz series, like, Chris Paul won them that series in the mid-range in a lot of respects. I mean, he was able to penetrate, and he stopped, and he just shot over Rudy Gobert. And they talked about that a lot. Like, that, I think that was one of the reasons why Houston wanted to go out and get CP3, was because he provides that offensive variety that really becomes especially important in the playoffs when teams take away everything you want to do and you're left with things that maybe you don't want to do.
I mean, for sure. And then also, even James Harden was making mid-range shots as well. Not a ton, but there were enough when I went through every make he had against the Jazz that we were seeing that. They were really trying to sag off of him. And that's the other problem defensively. And what we saw with Rudy Gobert, which really frustrated me, was their whole take was, yes, we want to invite them to take a mid-range shot, but then they wouldn't, like, get a hand up. And that was like, and that was sort of my point before, which was, to a lot of these shooters, there is an expected value, expected field goal percentage would be higher in my mind on an open 17-footer than it would be on a 3. Now, here's the thing that I want to talk about, because a lot of times, the basic math is, and correct me if I'm wrong, you need to shoot 60% from 2 to equal 40% from 3. That's sort of the maxim, right?
Yeah, I mean, if you go back and look to see what, these teams shoot from every part of the court, you can figure that out. And it basically, I mean, I think I have this in the story. It works out to, like, the average return across the NBA. So not for the Warriors, and especially not for Steph Curry. A long 2 is about 0.8 points per shot, whereas, like, something in the paint is like 1.25, and something behind the 3-point line is like 1.1, and probably, like, a catch and shoot 3 or something that is not like a force 3 28 feet away is a lot higher than that. So clearly the basic math shows that it's not a good shot.
Fair enough. But again, we're talking about everybody who's ever taken a shot in the NBA from that position. So, Kyle Korver's expected field goal percentage from on an open 18, 19, 20-footer has to be a lot higher than that, right?
Yes. Yeah, totally. And, and you look at Steph, I mean, Steph shot 59% from the mid-range this year. It's like the best mid-range season in the last 20 years, like since the NBA started tracking this sort of thing. And he's gotten better in the mid-range, and it's because that's what he works on. He knows that teams are going to run him off the line, and they're going to give him probably an open, close to an open jumper or more of an open jumper that he would get from 24 feet. They'll give that to him from 18 or 19 feet. And if he takes it and he gets 1.2 points per shot there, it's a good shot for Steph Curry.
Yeah, a good shot for the team. It would ultimately be worth more. Now, do we know what Curry's point per possession is on threes? He shoots 40-something%. So what is that math?
I don't know what he's at this year, but if he shot 44%, it's like 1.3 points per shot, right?
Okay.
And and of course, like, you probably want Steph Curry taking a 3, but what he is saying is, like, don't, like, if you're going to give this to me, I will take it and I will make you pay for it.
Yeah. So here, I guess the next iteration of this is, okay. And by the way, what I thought was interesting about the historical aspect of your numbers was that the mid-range went up more recently than when KD first arrived. I would have thought that the first season he was there was when we would have seen a bigger jump in the mid-range, because he did seem to have that game that would indicate that. So, but you didn't see that, right? What you noticed was that it was only this year was when the mid-range perked up.
I think that's right. I think it kind of held steady last year, if I remember correctly. I can check this really quickly, but yeah, it was this year, and it was because of the way the teams were guarding them, and it's because they were at the forefront of the way that offenses are changing, right? And defenses scrambled to catch up, and their solution was to give them this shot. So this was the first year that they started taking more of their shots, because it was the first time that it was really offered to them, I think.
Yeah, and by the way, from a coaching perspective, I'll just throw this in there because people might be listening and thinking, well, and I think a lot of analytics guys will say there really isn't anything you can do defensively to contest or to combat a three-point shot. I think that a lot of guys think it's sort of random as far as what the defense is doing. And I would point out that that's absolutely not true at all. In fact, what you end up seeing is people leaving their feet to contest shots in the air, which is what they've noticed has the most effect on a three-point shot, and then not helping one pass away, and then also trying to stop middle penetration. Those are the big three for limiting three-point shots. And so, but what is your thought about that? Like, are you seeing things that teams are doing specifically that are somehow, limiting the number of field goal attempts?
From the mid-range or from three?
From three.
Oh, I mean, you would be able to describe the actual strategies much better than I do, but I think it's pretty clear that defenses in the NBA now are designed to stop you around the rim and run you off the three-point line, right?
Yeah. I mean,
it might have there might be a question of how effective it is in terms of efficiency from three-point line, but I feel it's pretty clear that they want to reduce the number of three-point attempts. We saw Brad Stevens was talking last night, that was their game plan going in against the Sixers, single team Embiid, make you not double and create open looks for the three-point shooters, and it very clearly worked, right?
They certainly are preparing for the conference finals right now, so I don't know how that necessarily affected the end of that game because it was pretty crazy.
Well, they started doubling him again, right? I mean, he was too good that they couldn't single him anymore. So in the fourth quarter, they start doubling Embiid, and they got a whole lot of look. I think JJ is going to be thinking about that open three he missed for the whole summer at this point. But the Celtics got away with it, and I know we're talking about the Warriors, but that series was so interesting because. Brad even said last night, their defense got worse and the Celtics offense got better as the series went on. And if the Sixers won that game last night, I think they were winning that series, don't you?
You know what? I started to have thoughts of that because then they go back to Game 6 at home, and that could be a game they could take with the crowd behind them and everything. And then, the problem is it's even if we're talking stats, the home team in Game 7 is still such a prohibitive favorite that you can't pick against that. But you never know.
I think that's right. But then you look back at the series and you're like, well, they were up more than 20 in Game 2. They somehow blew. I was at Game 3, and I'm still not really sure how the Celtics won. I mean, I know how they won, but every time they scored, it felt like a small miracle. And then you have last night. I mean, they won 3 games by the seat of their pants, and I'm not really sure how much longer they could have kept doing that in that series. But that's why you only have to win 4.
Right, and by the way, we could talk about that too because this is a free rambling podcast. Because the notion of T.J. McConnell, which I think Brett Brown might be kicking himself as well for not going to that earlier, opened things up. And I think, did you see the net ratings? Either it was net rating or plus minus of all the players in the series. Did you see that?
I didn't see the final, but I checked early in the fourth quarter, and McConnell was plus 34, and Simmons was minus 50 or something.
Yeah, so that must be just plus minus, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, okay. Because I kind of half looked at it on my phone while I was driving, I wasn't driving. Sorry, I just happened to have looked at my phone, and so I saw that. But yeah, that's pretty damning when you look at Ben Simmons of all people having that much of a deleterious effect on the team. And then by putting T.J. McConnell in there, it kind of gave them another way of getting their offense going. But actually, let's talk about that for a second because I'm kind of curious. As we're moving towards the future of the game, do you feel like we're going to end up having the averages 53-point shots attempts a game?
Well, I think the Rockets probably feel that way. I mean, it's a question that I've talked about with a lot of people around the league because. I know that these things are cyclical and they are trends and they are supposed to change. But I just don't understand what stops this, right? Like what stops the momentum of the 3-pointer? It's literally worth one more shot than the 2-pointer, right? One more point than the 2-pointer. So I just don't know, what would stop the upward momentum here. It's gone up and up every, for however many years now. And players are better shooters and teams rely on the 3-pointer more. I know that defenses are going to adapt, but I think, I just don't know. You have the Rockets like, setting offensive records for the last 2 years by taking more 3-pointers than anyone thought possible. Like, why would teams stop taking 3-pointers at this point?
Right. Well, I mean, I think one reason is if, you kind of start to see a problem with in the playoffs, if it's not yielding success there, then we'll have to look at something. And by the way, I think this is what the point of the whole podcast is that, sort of the Warriors have figured that out to some degree, right? And that there needs to be a better balance.
They're still the team that embodies the effect of the 3-pointer. And let's not forget, like, the Cavs' best lineup is when they put LeBron on the court and surround him with 3-point shooting, right? I mean, the teams win like this, right? I mean, John Hollander wrote this incredible thing like 10 years ago at this point that basically said, like, if you want to start winning games, shoot more 3-pointers. And I don't think that's really changed over the last 10 years.
Yeah, and I don't want to make it seem like I'm against the 3-pointer. I mean, I was a 3-point shooter when I played, and it just came in when I was in high school. And there's no question I envisioned, an offense that I would run as a team that would be raining down threes. I think my take was always that, if your offense could generate 50 good threes a game, then you take 50 good threes a game. And I kind of want to do a video on this over in the offseason about the bad 3-pointers, right? Because I would still say there's about 15% of the threes taken overall are just for the sake of shooting a three. They're not open. They're rushed. They're completely, the guys are all over them. It's bad spacing. It's bad shot clock, whatever. And I feel like that, the shot selection notion is the only thing that's going to end up coming out of this that maybe will adjust what that is. But you're right. I mean, I think at some point it can't keep increasing, right? I mean, at some point is my house going to be worth 20 times as much as it's worth now going in the future? Like, no, we have those moments where things will slow down or stop. But I don't know. I mean, to me, maybe the only solution is to back the 3-point line up a little bit.
I think that's interesting, and I think you're right. At some point, the league will find the optimal ratio of 3-pointers. But one of the things that's interesting is that it wasn't so long ago that it seemed like the NBA had found that exact ratio. So this seems like almost impossible now. But the entire history of the 3-point line, it goes on the court in the NBA in 1980, and pretty much every season until 2007, the number of 3-pointers goes up and up and up, right? And there's that little blip in the middle when they move to the 3-point line, and then percentages get a little screwy. But for the most part, it's a constantly upward trajectory. So they go up and up and up, and then from 2008 until 2012, it completely plateaus. It levels off. From 2008 until 2012, those 5 seasons, the number of 3-pointers that accounted for field goal attempts was 22.2%. It was as if the NBA was behaving, that they'd come to this collective realization that 1 out of every 5 shots, give or take, should be a 3-pointer. And there's this period of stasis, which seems almost impossible now because of what's happened since then. In the last 5 years, we've gone from 22.2% to 33.7%, and it keeps going up and up and up. So it's like, what happened in those 5 years, and like what's happened since then? Like, we're clearly working towards something more. And I think the most progressive people in the league think that we're still nowhere near the number, like the peak number of 3-pointers that we're going to see. But it's just interesting to go back and look at something that wasn't all that long ago, 2012, when 3-pointers only accounted for 22% of shots across the league.
Yeah, you're right. It's crazy. And I'd like to look at it that way, as a percentage of shots, because that gives you a sense of how you can compare. Now, I think the other interesting thing has to be, aside from the 33% of the shots that are threes, is that the pace has the pace changed any significantly since 2012 or 2013?
Yeah, it's gotten faster, right?
I think so, but I had to look at it over time. But I would imagine that's the other thing, right? So we're generating more possessions, and that means more shots. But I guess you're right. That is why we have to keep it as a percentage. So yeah, I think that there is a happy medium here ultimately. But you're right. It still feels like it's gonna I bet you we'll get to 40% before we start to see any kind of slowdown. Wouldn't you think?
Yeah, probably. I mean, the Rockets were over 50% this year, right? So they were the first team ever to take more threes than twos, and it worked out pretty well for them. So, by the way, pace is way up. Since, we knew this, but since 2012, it's gone from 91 possessions per 48 minutes to 97 this year. So
Wow.
it's definitely faster, and not only are teams taking more three-pointers, three-pointers are accounting for a greater percentage of those shots, which of course is how you should look at this stuff. So
Sure. And it was funny. I was watching. Oh my goodness! It was in the first round, one of the series, and gosh, I'll have to. I don't know if it was Portland and whatever, but either way, we were getting a glimpse into what the basketball would look like even 10 years from now, because it was all there was no triple threat. It was all attack on the catch. It was all a lot of fast ball movement, fast player movement, a lot of threes, up and down. It was kind of dizzying, and it's not the game that we've been playing even now, or certainly 5, 6, 7 years ago. It's a completely different game, and that was concerning to me. And I don't know if the fans are going to to be able to go along with that as well. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, why wouldn't the fans come along? I mean, it seems like it's if the only way I think that this stuff could change is if there was some sort of external rule change that changed behavior, but. The league doesn't really have much incentive to change the rules, because I think the product right now is seen as pretty damn good, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, right. Scoring, dunks, threes, that's the idea that you want to sell. And you're right. There's always a huge section of the fan base that likes that. There's always the curmudgeons who complain about travels. And when I was their age, you couldn't do that, that whole thing. So, yeah. So you're right, and I think maybe it's like the Beatles, their gradual move from "She Loves You" to Sgt. Pepper's, right? We all move along with that, and we adjust to it. But I do say, and I think it's very clear to me that whatever the game looks like 10 years from now is going to be completely different. And so I think the next iteration, because we can kind of see that on offense what that looks like. I think the defense is going to be the next thing that needs to change. And I was actually just trying to think about this the other day is what that means. I think that there might end up being some really radical, strange things that people do now are going to start doing to combat that. Now, we did see the random double team of LeBron James at half court against when he was playing against the Pacers. And that was a nightmare for them. It didn't really work really well. But I kind of start to feel like we might start seeing a lot more weird gambling, zone-ish kind of stuff from the defense.
I think that's probably the natural next step. I mean, it's adapting to the evolution that we've seen. I mean, and in many ways, this offensive change is a response to the defense that Tibbs brought into the NBA over the last 10 years, right?
Yeah, we'll give him the credit. Yes. So certainly icing the pick and roll, forcing everybody away from the screens. And by the way, that's now changed radically too. Now everyone wants to switch. And,
right.
and that's the other thing is, right, by switching you can kind of blow up a lot of that action, which, by the way, is why I think that the Rockets don't really have a great chance against the Warriors in the series. So, yeah, I think that switching, and by the way, this is not even new. What the Warriors are doing is basically putting out guys who are all between, I guess except for Curry, everyone is 6'6" to 6'9" or 6'10", and they're all long and they're all, interchangeable. Pat Riley had this idea back when he was coaching Magic Johnson. He's like, I want to get 5 Magic Johnsons and all play the same position and just go out that way. I think he had already seen that back then. So I would suspect that, we probably are going to start seeing that too, where we'll see point guards who are 6'7" and he can handle the ball and can shoot. And then your centers are going to be I think Kevin Durant will ultimately be the center that we'll see in 10 years.
By the way, I think having 5 Magic Johnsons is a good strategy for your team.
Well, here's the thing. Magic really, even at the end there, he wasn't really a good shooter. Would it have mattered?
Yeah, I mean there's also the question of if Magic played today, would he be a better shooter, because that would have been a more important part of his game.
Yes, that is true, and I think also the key here is we understand how to teach shooting a lot better, and that's a huge thing, which is another reason why I'm convinced we'll start seeing more Steph Currys. We will have 5 Steph Currys in 4 or 5 years. All those 10-year-olds have been watching him this whole time. They're going to get to the NBA. And they're going to have to, that ability to shoot off the bounce. Which, by the way, the other combat of that, I guess, it has to also be kind of like what we mentioned with Draymond Green, where the goal of the defense for the Rockets, for instance, is going to be get Draymond Green to shoot as many threes as possible. Yep. So I almost feel like the radical shift for defense coming up will be whoever's on the court, they are simply going to choose the one guy that they're going to completely not guard, short of a layup. and just try, and that's the solution, is get the fifth guy out there that you don't want to shoot, and even if he's good, let him shoot all the shots or as many shots as possible.
But that's what the playoffs is, right? The playoffs are about, like, you know so much about this team that you're playing over the course of 7 games that you have to take advantage of your little advantages. And so, if you have to find the one weakness on their team and you exploit it until you make them make an adjustment. And like, if Draymond is going to shoot 40% on 3-pointers in this series, like, the Rockets are not going to win. But if he shoots 12%, then they will, and if he shoots somewhere in between, then who knows what happens. Right.
Yeah. Exactly. And also it's the ability to identify that every possession down, or as many possessions as possible. So I did a video on the Toronto Raptors where they just didn't seem to understand how they wanted to attack on offense. Who's the defensive weak link that they want to get every time, right? Whereas the Cleveland Cavaliers on the other end were just surgical. They were like, we are going to hit him and him, and we're going to make sure we get that advantage every single time, or at least way more than the Raptors did, and that's what a sweep happens. So I think it's
not only identify it, but keep identifying it over the course of the series, right?
Yeah, and then quickly. So, sometimes teams were like, oh, wait, we had a mismatch down low in the post, but they take 10 seconds to get it down there. And now there's no time for the shot. But, the good teams, the really well-prepared teams, are able to find that right away. And you know what? Even if Lou is not preparing them well, when you have LeBron James, he just identifies that stuff way ahead of time. It's pretty impressive. So, well, listen. This was a fantastic discussion about this, and I hope it kind of, at least people who are listening to this will start to kind of get an idea that, the mid-range doesn't need to go away. And in fact, it could be a strategy that, I think the key here is the balance, right? You don't want to go too extreme on your diet. You don't want to go too extreme on the threes either. It seems like that's always going to be the case, even in the basketball. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, depending on the personnel, right? I mean, if you have guys who are shooting 30% from the mid range, then I would go on a mid range diet and not take all that many of those. But if you have a well balanced team, then it's clearly going to be a part of the game. Because even when it wasn't a part of the game, like teams, it wasn't as if teams were capable of just ignoring it completely, right? Like I like to you almost like to think of it as like, there are the mid range is like swimming with piranhas, and you're trying to avoid it, with everything in your power, which a lot of teams are, but they're still taking 10 shots, between 10 and 25 shots there a game. So like that's a pretty significant portion, and like when you take those shots, it certainly helps when you can shoot 50% from there.
Right, and the flip side of that is, okay, if someone's shooting 30% from the mid range, well, they ain't going to be shooting that well from 3 as far as I can tell. Like, those guys are just not good shooters no matter what. So now you're kind of stuck, where I guess the point being as we move along is that simply those guys will not be able to play. Now, here's what's interesting about this really quickly as we wrap up. The two of the biggest stars we have, up-and-coming stars, are almost non-shooters, right? Ben Simmons and Antetokounmpo. Neither of whom are good shooters. And I find that really fascinating that we're in a situation here where they also can have a significant impact on the court scoring, and yet they don't have any spacing.
Totally. And people like to look at them and you project out, well, what if these guys do have 3-point shots? I mean, then you're talking about guys who are just like pretty much unstoppable. And I think, the other important thing to remember about the mid-range is that, a lot of the 3-point revolution that sort of made the mid-range a little bit obsolete was convincing those guys who were so good from 16 to 24 feet to take a step back and start shooting threes, like Marc Gasol and LaMarcus Aldridge and these bigs who already had good shots and simply for their entire lives weren't allowed to shoot 3-pointers, giving them permission, like, take the shot. It's a better shot for you. You don't have to ignore the mid-range, but like take a few steps back and get the extra point for it. And, that is not an issue for Steph Curry, right?
Right. he can keep stepping back, and it's pretty impressive. So, well, listen, Ben, thank you so much for coming on the show and breaking this down for us. For sure, everyone should definitely check him out over at the Wall Street Journal. And you have to come back on and we'll talk some more.
Great. Thanks for having me, man.
You got it. And don't forget, sports fans, at B-Ball Breakdown, we're not a channel, we're a conversation. You in? Are you in, Ben?
I'm in.